the 8th of March, 1938, Burbank, California. The Douglas DC-4E sat gleaming on the tarmac under the California sun, its 4 Pratt & Whitney engines silent, its fuselage longer and wider than any airliner ever built. Engineers and airline executives circled it like priests around an altar, clipboards in hand, measuring, calculating, judging. This was the future of commercial aviation, or so Douglas Aircraft had promised. 38 tons of aluminum, steel, and ambition. Pressurized cabin, triple tail, capacity for 42 passengers in sleeper berths. It was magnificent, it was revolutionary, it was also a failure. The airlines had wanted something simpler, cheaper, more reliable. The DC-4E was too complex, too heavy, too expensive to operate. United Airlines, which had commissioned the design, politely declined to purchase it. American Airlines showed no interest. TWA looked elsewhere. By the end of 1938, Douglas had shelved the project, writing off millions in development costs. The DC-4E, the aircraft that was supposed to dominate the skies of the 1942nd, had become an orphan, a technological marvel with no buyer, a solution in search of a problem. But across the Pacific, someone was watching. Someone who saw not a failed airliner, but the skeleton of a weapon. Someone who believed that American rejection could become Japanese redemption. And so began one of the strangest and most tragic chapters of the Pacific War, the story of how Japan bought America's discarded dream and forged it into a nightmare that would haunt its own skies. In 1938, the Imperial Japanese Navy faced a dilemma that kept its admirals awake at night. Japan's empire was expanding Manchuria, coastal China, the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia in its sights, but the distances were vast. Existing Japanese bombers aircraft like the Mitsubishi G3M had range, but they were fragile, lightly armed, vulnerable to modern fighters. What the Navy needed was a heavy bomber, a long-range, 4-engine giant capable of carrying massive bomb loads deep into enemy territory and returning home, a fortress of the sky. The problem was that Japan had never built anything like it. Japanese industry excelled at producing lightweight, maneuverable fighters. The lessons of the First World War and China had taught them to prize agility over armor, but a heavy bomber was a different beast entirely. It required advanced aerodynamics, powerful engines, robust structural design, and manufacturing techniques Japan had not yet mastered. So they looked abroad. Specifically, they looked to America. The relationship between the United States and Japan in the late 1930s was schizophrenic. Politically, tensions were rising over Japan's aggression in China. Economically, America remained Japan's largest supplier of oil, steel, and aviation technology. Japan's aircraft industry had been built on American designs. Mitsubishi licensed engines from Pratt & Whitney, Nakajima from Wright Aeronautical. Japanese engineers studied at American universities. Japanese procurement officers attended American air shows. And in 1938, when word reached Tokyo that Douglas Aircraft had a large, 4-engine transport aircraft sitting unsold in California, the Japanese saw an opportunity. The Japanese delegation arrived in Burbank in the summer of 1938. They were polite, formal, meticulously dressed. They toured the Douglas factory. They examined the DC-4E in exhaustive detail, measuring the wingspan, photographing the engine mounts, studying the landing gear, scrutinizing the control surfaces. Douglas engineers, unaware of the military implications, answered their questions with American openness. This was commerce, after all. This was business. The Japanese purchased the DC-4E for $90,000, a fraction of its development cost. They also purchased a complete set of blueprints, technical specifications, and manufacturing data. In October 1938, the aircraft was disassembled, crated, loaded onto a freighter, and shipped across the Pacific to Yokosuka Naval Air Technical Arsenal. What the Japanese intended was audacious: reverse engineer the DC-4E and transform it into the G5N. one a four-engine heavy bomber capable of striking targets across the Pacific. They believed that by copying American design excellence and adapting it to Japanese needs, they could leapfrog a generation of development. They believed that the DC-4E's robust airframe, powerful engines, and long range would translate seamlessly into military capability. They were wrong. November 1945. Nakajima Aircraft Factory, Koizumi, Japan. The first prototype of the G5N Shinzan mountain recess rolled out of the assembly hangar. It looked imposing. 32 meters long, 42-meter wingspan, 4 Nakajima Mamoru engines, throbbing with 1,870 horsepower each. The engineers had labored for 3 years, translating American specifications into Japanese manufacturing reality, adapting civilian design to military purpose. Gun turrets had been added dorsal, ventral, tail, nose. Bomb bays had been carved into the fuselage. Armor plating protected the crew positions. The Shinzan was heavier than the DC-4E, more complex, and theoretically capable of carrying 4,000 kilograms of bombs across 3,700 kilometers. But from the moment the engines fired, the problems began. The Nakajima Mamoru engines, hastily developed copies of American radials, were underpowered and unreliable. They overheated, they leaked oil, they failed at altitude. The aircraft, now laden with military equipment and armor, was significantly heavier than the civilian DC-4E. The result was catastrophic performance degradation. Maximum speed, barely 370 kilometers per hour, slower than most contemporary fighters. Service ceiling, only 7,000 meters, well within range of anti-aircraft fire. Range, reduced by the fuel-hungry engines and increased weight. The Shinzan could not reach the speeds, altitudes, or distances its mission required. Worse, the construction techniques posed insurmountable challenges. The DC-4E had been designed for American manufacturing, precision machining, standardized parts, advanced metallurgy. Japanese industry in 1941, for all its ingenuity, lacked the industrial base to replicate these standards at scale. Tolerances were inconsistent, materials were substituted, structural integrity suffered. The Shinzan was plagued by vibrations, control issues, structural failures. A test pilot, Lieutenant Commander Takahashi, filed a report after an early flight. The aircraft is sluggish, unstable at low speeds, and struggles to maintain altitude with a full bomb load. It is outmatched by every Allied fighter likely to encounter it. I do not recommend operational deployment, but the Imperial Japanese Navy, desperate for a heavy bomber and having already invested enormous resources, pressed forward. By December 1941, when Japan launched its attacks on Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, and Malaya, only 6 G5N Shinzan bombers had been completed. None saw combat in the opening months of the war. They were assigned to training units, used to familiarize crews with four-engine operations, kept far from the front lines where their deficiencies would be brutally exposed. Meanwhile, Japan's enemies were fielding true heavy bombers. The American B-17 Flying Fortress, 4 engines, 450 kilometers per hour maximum speed, 10,850-meter service ceiling, bristling with 50 caliber machine guns, capable of flying from Hawaii to Japan if necessary. The British Lancaster, 4 Merlin engines, 7,000 kilogram bomb capacity, proven in night raids over Germany. These were purpose-built weapons of strategic air power. The Shinzan was a compromised imitation of a rejected airliner, struggling to fulfill a role it was never designed for. In 1943, the Japanese Navy made a final attempt to salvage the program. They contracted Nakajima to produce an improved version, the G5N Shinzan, mountain range. This would be an entirely new design, incorporating the lessons learned from the Shinzan disaster. Larger engines, pressurized cabin, heavier defensive armament. It first flew in October 1944 of Führer. By then, American B-29 seconds were already firebombing Japanese cities from altitudes the Shinzan could barely reach. The war was lost. Only 4 Shinzan prototypes were ever completed. The 7th of August 1945, Yokosuka Naval Air Technical Arsenal. The same facility where the DC-4E had been disassembled 7 years earlier was now in ruins. American carrier aircraft had bombed it repeatedly. The workshops were gutted, the runways cratered, and in a corner of a burned hangar sat the wreckage of a G5N Shinzan, its fuselage torn open, its engines stripped for parts, its wings blackened by fire. An American technical intelligence officer, Captain William Fletcher, walked through the debris days after Japan's surrender. He had been tasked with cataloguing Japanese aviation technology, identifying anything of value or interest. When he came upon the Shinzan, he paused. He recognized the configuration, the triple tail, the fuselage profile. He had seen a Douglas DC-4 before the war. In his report, he wrote, "The Japanese attempted to convert a commercial transport design into a heavy bomber. The result was predictably inadequate. The aircraft suffers from chronic engine failures, poor performance, and structural deficiencies. It is unclear why they pursued this program, given the availability of superior indigenous designs. The project appears to have been a costly failure, consuming resources that could have been allocated elsewhere." What Fletcher could not fully grasp, what few outside the inner circles of Japanese military planning could understand, was the desperation that had driven the Shinzan program. Japan had known, even before Pearl Harbor, that it could not match American industrial capacity. The strategy had always been to strike quickly, secure resource-rich territories, fortify a defensive perimeter, and force a negotiated peace before American production overwhelmed them. The Shinzan was supposed to be part of that strategy, a long-range bomber that could strike American bases, disrupt supply lines, threaten the West Coast itself. It was supposed to be the weapon that made the Pacific too costly for America to cross. Instead, it became a symbol of Japan's fundamental miscalculation. The belief that American technology could be copied without American infrastructure, that shortcuts could replace development, that an airliner rejected for being too complex could be simplified into an effective weapon. The DC-4E, the aircraft that started it all, had its own strange epilogue. After the Japanese purchased it in 1938, Douglas redesigned the DC-4 from scratch, simpler, lighter, more practical. This new DC-4 became the C-54 Skymaster, the workhorse transport of the Allied war effort. Over 1,200 were built. They carried troops, supplies, and equipment across every theater of the war. They flew the hump over the Himalayas, supplied the D-Day invasion, evacuated wounded from Pacific Islands. President Roosevelt flew in one to the Yalta Conference. The aircraft Japan had hoped to turn into a weapon became, in American hands, an instrument of victory, not through violence, but through logistics, not through destruction, but through supply. The very abundance that the DC-4, C-54, represented the ability to move men and materiel across oceans, to keep armies fed and equipped, to project power through industrial capacity, was the abundance Japan could never match. The Shinzan, by contrast, represented scarcity of engines, of materials, of manufacturing expertise, of time. It was born of desperation and died in obsolescence, a monument to the gap between ambition and capability. Today, no G5N Shinzan bombers survive. They were scrapped after the war, cut up for metal, erased from the physical world. Only photographs remain, grainy black and white images of an ungainly aircraft that never found its purpose. Aviation historians debate whether the Shinzan was history's worst heavy bomber. Some argue that distinction belongs to the Italian Piaggio P-108 or the German Heinkel He-177, both plagued by their own catastrophic flaws. But the Shinzan holds a unique place. It was the only heavy bomber built from a rejected civilian design, a Frankenstein's monster of reverse engineering and misapplied ambition. There is a lesson in this story, though it is not the one Japan's military planners intended to teach. Technology cannot be stolen or copied into greatness. It must be built upon foundations of research, of infrastructure, of institutional knowledge, of industrial capacity. The DC-4E failed in America not because American engineers were incompetent, but because they learned from the failure, adapted, and built something better. The Shinzan failed in Japan because the lessons could not be learned quickly enough, because the infrastructure did not exist to support the ambition, because the war did not allow time for the iterations that innovation requires. And there is a darker truth, that desperation makes poor decisions, that nations on the edge of disaster grasp at solutions that gleam with promise but crumble under scrutiny, that the belief in shortcuts, in quick fixes, in borrowed brilliance, leads not to redemption but to ruin. Somewhere in a California museum, a restored DC-4 sits polished and proud, a testament to the evolution of commercial aviation. It never dropped a bomb, it never fired a gun, but it won the war nonetheless by doing what it was designed to do: move people and cargo efficiently, reliably, abundantly. The Shinzan, built to destroy, could not even do that. It could barely fly. And in the end, the mountains it was named for, those remote, unreachable peaks, remained as distant as the victory Japan had imagined. The aircraft, built from America's rejection, became a symbol of Japan's miscalculation, and the skies that were supposed to tremble beneath its wings remained silent, empty, waiting for the thunder of engines that never came.